open, if you will, to 1 Kings chapter 16. 1 Kings 16 is where we left off. We're going to be picking up with verse number 8. And does anybody recall who's just finished up his reign over Israel? And it wasn't very good. Hint, hint. Baasha, yes. And he was in power for 24 years. Now, that's not the musical chairs stuff. That's staying in place for some time, but we're about to enter the musical chairs. Well, we find in verse 8 of 1 Kings 16, in the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah. Remember, he reigns for 41 years. And to our teenagers, the way the books of Kings work is you'll be dealing with a period of, in the divided kingdom, of kings in, say, Israel for, a ruler, a couple rulers, and then you'll switch back over to Judah because then you got to catch back up. And so we kind of flop back and forth in the chronology of things. This is in the 26th of the 41 years that Asa reigns. So it's past halfway, about 2/3 roughly of the way through. King of Judah, Elah, the son of Baasha, became king over Israel, and he reigned for 2 years in Tirzah. Now, we were talking about Baasha, and how were things in Israel under Baasha's reign, on his watch for 24 years? For our class people in here before. Baasha. Let me see if I can give a little hint. I'm going to define his name for you. Baasha, the Hebrew, means wicked. Well, okay, that sums it up pretty well. And I hope I'm not overdoing this with these, but I'll get in my studies about half or more through a word or a name, and it's like, I kind of wonder what that means. And I'll look it up, and then I'll go back, and I'll go all the way back to the beginning, and then I'll go to the end and start looking these up. So I want to share some of these that I found. I find them fascinating. Yeah, he didn't deserve it. Yeah, and his kids and grandkids aren't going to get it, right? Yeah, but that he reigned. So Baasha was 24, but his son, his son Elah here is 2 years. Good. And we go back to the earlier kings, and you have Jeroboam, and then his son Nebat. And I thank you for bringing that up, Shane. I wanted to draw some corollaries here. There are eerie similarities in these northern kings and the way things working with their kids. So you have Jeroboam, who's the first king over the north, and he reigns for 22 years. And then his son Nebat comes in, and he's just like his dad. He's a real mess. And he reigns only for 2 years until he's overthrown. He's overthrown by Baasha, who executes and does away with this dynastic line that you have. And then Baasha reigns for about the same period as this dynasty's predecessor, Jeroboam. Jeroboam's 22 years, Baasha's 24 years. Well, then his son, Baasha's son, who is Elah, reigns for 2 years, just like Nebat, Jeroboam's son did, and he gets overthrown also, and a new dynasty is going to come into place. So it's strange. So I appreciate that up. Yeah, Baasha, he's a disaster from start to finish. Doesn't listen to God, engages in all these idolatrous acts. Okay, so we're in verse 8. His name means wicked. Okay, he names his son though Elah. Elah means an oak. Now, when you think of an oak, what comes to mind? Strength. What else? So you have stability that's in place. And in part maybe because of that, an oak's probably going to outlive you, right? An oak stays in place as its stability and as life is very long. There's been a message delivered through a prophet to Baasha that basically it's all over for him, and we don't know exactly when this son comes along and all that kind of stuff, but it's almost like, whatever. We're going to do things my way, and things are going to be fine. In fact, my son, he's going to be an oak, he's going to be well established, and he's going to live a long time. No, he's not, because God said otherwise, and that's the way that works. By the way, time frame-wise, we're looking at about 885 to 884 BC. 885, 884 BC, Elah's in place. Go down to verse 9. Now that is Elah's servant. Remember, we're talking about the north. And by the way, I want to go ahead and switch over to our map. This might help us a little bit. So our geographic divide, especially for these guys who are coming in, is at a latitude of about the north portion of the Salt Sea. right around that, and it's not clearly delineated here, but you can just draw a little squiggly line basically across that northern part of the Dead Sea. There we go, from a spot about up here on over. And that's where the divide geographically of Israel, politically also, and Judah are found. So we're dealing with the northern section in Judah, and you look at the north central portion of the map, and you have Tirzah going right just a little bit down from right there. Tirzah, that's where the current capital is located of Israel. So this is where Elah is staying. This is where his predecessor Baasha was, where Nabat was, as well where Jeroboam lived in the palace in Tirzah. Now, before that, it was found where? Jeroboam moves it at some point. Where was it found prior? It's one of those S words up there. It was in Shechem, not in Shiloh. That's important for before that. But it was in Shechem, okay? And then it moves what's roughly 20, 25 miles to the north to Tirzah. Well, it's about to move again today during our study, but we'll get to that when the time's right. Okay, so verse 9. Now his servant, that's Elah's servant, who's king of Israel and the son of Baasha, his Zimri, commander of half his chariots. Pause. Zimri's in charge of half of the chariots in the military. Now let's read between the lines here. What does that mean about the other half? What's insinuated here? Okay, there's a splicing of sorts that there's somebody else who's in charge of the other half. Keep that in mind, okay? So there are at least two important military figures here, and that's going to come into play. Zimri, though, is commander of half of Elah's chariots, and this guy conspired against him as he was in Tirzah, showed on the map, north central, drinking himself drunk. Well, that sounds like a good king. That's the kind you want, right? Drinking himself drunk in the house of Arzah, steward of his house in Tirzah. What I'd like for you to do is go ahead just a hair. You probably don't even have to turn a page. Look in verse 15, 1 Kings 16. The ending of verse 15. What's going on politically and militarily right now in the country of Israel? The people were encamped against Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines. So there's war that's taking place at this juncture. And what we find out about this king of Israel is he's nowhere to be found, anywhere near the battle. He's back at home, probably doing important kingly things like getting drunk. You know, what else are you going to do? Oh, hang on just a second. Why is this guy not leading his troops in a time when that's what kings do? I mean, leaders of countries don't really do that today, and there's some reasons for it. But why isn't he out leading his troops? They're fighting against the Philistines at Gibbethon, and if you want to follow this over to the right, it's going to disappear, my laser. But that's Gibbethon in the area of the Philistines. They're trying to take this back from these pesky people toward the Israelites. Why is he not out there leading his troops into battle? I think there might be some history to this. Flip back to chapter 15. Chapter 15. See if you recall this. Toward the end of the chapter, 25 through 28. So, king of Israel and Jeroboam. And then you have his son, the second one, and Nadab, verse 25. Now Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, became king over Israel in the second year, this is about a quarter of a century ago, of Asa, king of Judah. And he reigned over Israel 2 years. Not very good. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, walked in the way of his father, and his sin by which he had made Israel sin. Then Baasha, the son of Ahijah, of the house of Issachar, conspired against him. And Baasha killed him at, guess where? Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines, while Nadab and all Israel laid siege to Gibbethon. Baasha killed him in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, and then he took over, reigned in his place. And that's the end of that dynasty. Now, leading up to these events, you have a prophet of the Lord who's come to Jeroboam and told him, hey, your reign's coming to an end, you're going to crash and burn, and all your family's going to die. And then the overthrow of the dynasty takes place while they're away, and the king is leading the charge, fighting against the Philistines in Gibbethon. Well, the guy who overthrew him in that place comes to power, Baasha. And he goes through his reign, and toward the end of it, you have a prophet of God who shows up and he says, you are a disaster. You are going to crash and burn, and your entire house is going to be gone. Well, after about 20 years of reign, just like Jeroboam, he dies, and his son comes into power, and guess what? There's conflict with the Philistines at Gibbethon, and there's a battle going on there. And after 2 years of reigning, just like the previous one, Nebat, why do you think maybe he doesn't want to go fight in this battle? That's where the previous regime lost their dynasty. And so maybe he thinks, hey, maybe he's a little, it could be Heath that he's not superstitious, maybe he's just a little stitious. And he doesn't want to go, and he's afraid he's going to lose it in this place. And so maybe he thinks, hey, if I stay at home and behind closed doors, I'm safe. And maybe he thinks the prophecy of the Lord can't be fulfilled then. Perhaps he thinks he's okay. So he stays behind. He's drinking in his buddy's house. He's drunk by this point. By the way, Zimri means my music, or maybe the concept of music to my ears. Not to this family, he's not going to be. And I also wanted to find the guy's name in the house where he's getting drunk. Arza. His name means earthy or earthly. How fitting. He's living according to the ways of this world and not by the standards of God. By the way, he could be an accomplice in this. This may be a setup that's going on in his house. Very possible. But this much we do know, that Elah, the son of Baasha, who's been reigning in Tirzah for 2 years, has one of his commanders in the army who's in charge of half of his military chariots, conspires against him, and when he's drunk back at home, and by the way, maybe Zimri's upset because he realizes Israel has no king right now. And he probably sees that, hey, I'm out here essentially on the battlefield doing the job of a king. I might as well have the title and all the benefits that come along with it. Let's get rid of this guy who's nothing more than a political puppet, and let's have a real king in his place. Verse 10 of chapter 16. And Zimri went in and struck him, the king, and killed him in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah. And now he gets to reign in his place. So Zimri has the chance he sees to be the new Baasha. And since we don't have this dynasty thing as a real threat anymore, let's kill this guy, get him out of the way, and now my family, he's thinking, can be in charge. This happens in 884 BC. Will that be the way it unfolds? Verse 11. Then it came to pass, when he began to reign, as soon as he was seated on the throne, that he killed all the household of Baasha, 2 kings earlier. He did not leave him one male, neither of his relatives nor of his friends. Where has Zimri learned to do this? If you want power and think you should have it, you just kill the guy who's in place and you take over. And then you find all the relatives and you execute all of them. Now you're set up for life. Where has he learned this? Oh, we reap what we sow. This is exactly what the former family did to obtain their power. And by the way, I think this is why it's such a mess in Israel. I know this might sound strange and being a part of a culture that's so anti-monarchy, but when you don't have a ruling family in place, a lot of times under a monarchy there's complete chaos and confusion. It's just a constant power grab. And the biggest and the strongest, and I mean, you just have a total disaster on your hands for a country. Now, in the South, why do we not have all this same type of stuff taking place on a regular basis, quite like we see in the North? What do we have as far as ruling powers go in the South? I know you have different names, but what's true of the kingdom of Judah? There you go, and you have some good ones too, by the way, don't you? Asa, please God. All the kings of Judah come from what line? No? From David's line. Remember, it's the Davidic dynasty. And by the way, the Chronicles, for our kids and others who might not have heard as much of this, we're doing a harmony, even though we're spending most of our time in the Samuels and in the Kings. We're doing a harmony of the 6 books as they're split up, the Samuels, the Kings, and the Chronicles. And while in the Kings you have kind of a full history of both sides, In the Chronicles, it's almost exclusively about Judah. And the reason for that is the focus is on David and dynasty. David and dynasty. There's just one ruling family in the south. You have these constant changes going on in the north, and so it's survival of the strongest, of the fittest, and it's just a mess constantly. I want to go back to chapter 15. If you'll turn there with me, you might not need to flip. But chapter 15, we left off reading at the end in verse 28. Let's reread that. Baasha killed him, that is Nadab, who is the son of Jeroboam. Baasha killed Nadab in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, reigned in his place. So when he became king, that he killed all the house of Jeroboam. He did not leave to Jeroboam anyone that breathed, doesn't want any threats, until he had destroyed him according to the word of the Lord, which he had spoken by his servant Ahijah the Shilonite, because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he had sinned, and by which he had made Israel sin, the golden calf worship, all the idolatry. Essentially, he makes it illegal traveling to Jerusalem and worshiping the one living God in his holy temple, because of his provocation with which he had provoked the Lord God of Israel to anger. So he kills all the relatives of Nadab, all the relatives of Jeroboam. Cross over back again into our main text today, chapter 16. Chapter 16. Verse 11, as we read, he killed all the household of Baasha, the middle of the verse. He did not leave him one male, neither of his relatives, nor of his friends. So he takes this a step further, just in case there are any loyalists, even who aren't a part of the bloodline. Let's make sure to eradicate all of them. So he's not greatly upsetting just one family. He's upsetting a whole bunch of families, undoubtedly, in Israel by killing their relatives, simply on the basis of, I want to be the one who's in power. Verse 12, thus Zimri destroyed all the household of Baasha, according to the word of the Lord. Does that sound familiar? Which he spoke against Baasha by Jehu the prophet. It was for all the sins of Baasha and the sins of Elah, his son, by which they had sinned and by which they had made Israel sin in provoking the Lord God of Israel to anger with their idols. Look back in the first 4 verses of chapter 16. This is a reminder, while Baasha is still alive and still in power, the word of the Lord had come to Jehu, the son of Hanani, against Baasha, saying, inasmuch as I lifted you out of the dust, you were nothing. You were dirt on the ground on which people walked. And yet I made you, lifted you up, and made you walk over others, made you ruler over my people Israel. However, you have walked in the way of Jeroboam, and have made my people Israel sin to provoke me to anger with their sins. This is our memory verse. Surely I will take away the posterity of Baasha and the posterity of his house, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. The dog shall eat whoever belongs to Baasha and dies in the city, and the birds of the air shall eat whoever dies in the fields. Roy, not even going to be worthy of burial. The greatest of disgraces in the ancient world. That once you're gone, you don't even get buried in a grave or in a tomb. Animals in the wild are going to consume your children and your grandchildren's flesh, just like Jeroboam, because that's what you did. You overthrew Jeroboam in this way. I'm going to overthrow you and your family like you did to Jeroboam. It was fulfillment of the prophecy of the Lord. So we're in verse 14 of 1 Kings 16, verse 14. Now the rest of the acts of Elah, the guy who reigned for 2 years, Baasha's son, and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? Certainly they are. We cross over and read some of these. I don't think it's as imperative for this king. So we have a new king on the scene, the guy who has conspired, Zimri, and he's overthrown Elah to set up his own dynasty. Let's see how long his lasts. Hint, hint. It's just about time to get back to something that's no game at all that we're playing. Now it's starting to become musical chairs. 2 years isn't very long for a ruler. I mean, that's not even a presidential term. It'd be half of that. 2 years. Well, how long is Zimri going to reign in his conspiring? In the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah. That's in 884 BC, if you're still keeping track of that. 884 BC. In the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, Zimri had reigned in Tirzah, And so we'll go back to our map, and we know where that is, and that's in the top central of the one that we've used for a few class periods now, where the palace is located, the capital at this time. 7 days. He hasn't even gotten settled in yet. He's just started moving his stuff over into the palace. And the people, we already know this, were encamped against Gibbethon, and that's going to be about a good 75 miles down to the southwest. So, this is what's taking place at the moment. That belonged to the Philistines. Israel's trying to take it back for herself. Now the people who were encamped heard it said, well, back home, we're out here on the battlefield. And back home, Zimri has conspired and also has killed the king. So all Israel made Omri. That sounds a lot like the name we've been using. Zimri. Not the same person, right? Somebody completely different, 75 miles away. So all Israel made Omri, the commander of the army. This is the guy who it appears is in charge of all the armed forces. This is like Joab and like Abner of days of old. This is the Secretary of Defense, more or less. All Israel made somebody else, Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel, that day in the camp. Now, why does this make perfect sense? As this battle is being waged in Gibbethon, the former sitting king, Elah, sitting at home, enjoying himself with his alcohol, at leisure. And Zimri recognizes, I'm sure probably all Israel does, this is an embarrassment to it. We have no leader in battle. And I think that's probably why Zimri, commander of half of the king's chariots, rises up against him and kills him when he's drunk. But now Israel has to choose her own leader. And all the armed forces say, we know who we want. The guy who's been leading us out in battle. It makes perfect sense. But how tragic for Zimri. He's gone to all that effort, and the country's not even recognizing him as king. Well, he's made himself king back at home, while the troops, he's acting like the other king. He's not even out involved in the battle. He only reigns for 7 days. All Israel on the battlefield, they make Omri a true leader in conflict, the commander of the army, king over Israel that day in the camp. Verse 17. Then Omri and all Israel with him went up from Gibbethon, so they're going to make the trek 75 miles up to the northeast to the capital city of Israel, and they besiege Tirzah. And it happened when Zimri, who's been enjoying his reign for 7 days, he's made it to 1 week as king, as he's made himself that. They besiege it, and when Zimri sees that the city's taken, he went into the citadel, which you probably know, that's the strongest part of the castle. Essentially, he's on lockdown. This is the safe room. This is where you go when there's a tornado, okay? And you don't have to worry about anything. He goes into the citadel, the strongest point of the king's house, and he strikes a match. Perhaps he knocks over a lamp or something. And intentionally he does this. He commits suicide, it appears. He burns the king's house down upon himself with fire. And he died. Now he did this, and he's responsible for it. But notice in verse 19, the Bible says this was because of the sins which he had committed in doing evil in the sight of the Lord, and walking in the way of Jeroboam, and in the sin which he had committed to make Israel sin. And we're going to find in this as you continue on, verse 20, now the rest of the acts of Zimri and the treason which he committed. So it's interesting that he kills himself, but then God says, well, I caused him to die because he deserved it. Well, God didn't hands-on do it, right? But he's orchestrated all of these events to bring justice upon him. And then he accuses the guy of treason, even though he carries out what was God's plan all along for Elah and his household to be executed. And by the way, all of his friends. It's not right what these guys are doing. Even though the kings are entirely wicked, it's not proper for the people or anyone within the country just to rise up of his own accord and to kill somebody. That's murder. I ask you to keep your place and look back in Exodus chapter 22. This is when the law was originally given, and for this, rewinding nearly 600 years, a little shy of that. But read with me Exodus chapter 22 in verse 28. How God's people were supposed to treat their leaders. Exodus 22:28. Short and sweet. You shall not revile God. Don't you dare say something that is insulting towards your God. God is your ruler. He's the King of Kings, right? And right after that he says, nor had you better curse or insult a ruler of your people. You have the ruler over all, the King of Kings. And we know Daniel 4:17, he sets up the rulers that are all across the world throughout the course of time. He gives the king of nations to whomever he pleases, and he takes them away as he desires also. God is the King of all kings, and beneath him he has kings or rulers that he puts in place. And as we would not speak against our God as far as like insulting and those types of things, God said you are not to speak against or to insult a ruler of your people. Now Paul would later explain this in Romans 13, because it is God who by his will has put the people in place who are in power. That's not to be taken to mean that every ruler who's in place is righteous and doing exactly as God would first desire. No, God has purposes that he works. And when a people becomes evil, he loves to give people what they deserve. I say loves. He doesn't enjoy it. But as justice would have it, he gives people and nations who they deserve as their rulers. And that means a lot of times there are wicked rulers who are in place. Not because they're great people doing God's first choices, but because a people has become wicked. And so God is giving them what they deserve. And that's what's taking place with. Now, that being said, that doesn't give the right for someone who even wants to do the right thing and wants a people to do the right thing to become vigilantes of justice. We don't have the right to take out rulers that we feel like they're not doing a great job. And that's what's happening in Israel right now. These guys are not doing what's right, even though they're executing through their wickedness on wicked people what is the will of God. Not his first choices, but what needs to be done according to his demands of justice. These guys are wrong who are rising up against and executing these evil rulers. Zimri is not a hero of Israel, even though he killed a wicked ruler and took out a terrible dynasty in this place. He committed treason against God and treason against his own country. We continue on in verse 21. Then the people of Israel were divided into two parts. Well, wait a minute, didn't we just have this? Yeah, it's time for Civil War 2.0. The people of Israel divided into two parts. Half of the people followed Tibni, the son of Ganath, and the other half followed Imri. And each of them want to make these guys kings. As far as I'd like to tell you more about Tibni, we don't know a whole lot about him, but I looked up his name, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Tibni means intelligent. If you were to choose a ruler of your people, what kind of person do you want? Do you want the dummy, or do you want the smart guy? Okay. Now, I'm not saying that Omri's dumb or anything, but the point is this: he's a very intelligent person. He's probably sharp about military conflict, perhaps even diplomacy, and just about everyday life. So it makes sense that a lot of people would want to make this guy ruler, and the other ones follow Omri. Well, Omri makes a ton of sense. He's the commander over the people, and the people want someone who's going to lead the troops into battle. Verse 22, but the people who followed Omri prevailed over the people, who followed Tibni, the son of Ganath. So Tibni died, and Omri reigned. Now listen to this in verse 23. In the 31st year, I know sometimes it gets a little tedious, all the numbers and the math you have to do, but there's a reason that God gives ages of people, and he gives lengths of reigns of kings, and even in pagan monarchs. I think he intends to use this as benchmarks of history all along, so that you can follow a chronology, and that you can trace where we are today through Scripture all the way back to the beginning of time, and we can know how long we've been here. And we can know when it was that God created all things and when nearly all of these things happened along a historical timeline. So we have the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah. Now you go back to verse 15, and we read about in the 27th year of Asa, that's when Zimri had reigned 7 days, and then he commits suicide because Tirzah, where he's staying in the capital, is besieged. Omri's made king, but some people say, I say some, half. Half of Israel says, well, we want the super smart guy. We want the rocket scientist. We prefer to have Tibni in charge of us. And the expiration of time before everything is settled, all the dust, and all Israel recognizes Omri as king, is the 31st year of Asa. Remember, this skirmish began back in verse 15 in the 27th year. We've had civil war in Israel for how long? Okay, the subtraction is 4 years, and it's undoubtedly going to be 4 years and some change because you're counting the first year. So 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, probably not the fullness of that. So we're looking at 4 and what? A month? 4 and 11 months? We don't know that for sure. But between 4 and 5 years, there's been civil conflict. It helps me to appreciate the Bible a lot more, and I hope this is true of you, that it's just like so briefly past it. Wouldn't you love to know more? How fascinating, all the conflicts. I mean, 4 or 5, that's basically the American Civil War. And if you're writing about America's timeline, and you were just to say, well, you know, in 1860, tensions were getting pretty hot. In 1861, the first shots were fired. Well, now in 1865, it's like, there's so much that could be told about that. We don't need to know about all of it, but I'm sure it would be super fascinating. So the dust has settled in the civil conflict over Israel in 880 BC. That's where we are in the timeline, 880 BC. Omri became king over Israel, and he reigned 12 years. And I've looked at the timeline. It appears that goes back to the 27th year of Asa. I think it's counting all those years that the civil war is actually going on. And 6 years he reigned in Tirzah. And now for, where are we? At least 25 years, maybe a couple of generations, the capital has been moved in Israel from Shechem, about 20, 25 miles to the north, in Tirzah. But now here's where we encounter a change in verse 24. And he, Omri, bought the hill of Samaria. This is where Samaria becomes a power player in Israel's history. Bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver. Then he built on the hill and called the name of the city which he built Samaria. That's where it gets its name, after the name of Shemer. I didn't know this before this study. After Shemer, owner of the hill. Yes, sir. You go right ahead, John. Wait just a second. Let's let Parker get to you. Okay, John.
Help me to understand, is that 6 years within the 12, or is that 6 outside of the 12?
Yes. Is that an answer? No. Okay, so that appears to be 6 within the 12 is my understanding of it, yeah. Yeah, the 6 of it happened from there. And by the way, it's, a big part of this probably that doesn't occur, you know, it could be that he's staying outside of because of all the conflict that's going on, but it could be just that what would make a lot of sense is that it is inclusive of it, and perhaps he's even staying in the capital at this time, and then it moves, and then 6 years are spent at the new place. I think would make a lot of sense. Yeah, thanks, John. All right, so where are we here? Sorry, I lost my spot. No, you're good. I'd flip back, I think. That's not your fault. Okay, verse 24. There we go. Verse 24. So he's bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer, and it gets named after it for 2 talents of silver. So a few things here. If you look up, you can hear some similarities. Shemer or Shemer, Samaria, a little bit. But you look up these 2 words in Hebrew, and I'm not going to try to pronounce those 2 for you, but they're kissing cousins of one another. You basically can't tell them apart. And that makes a lot more sense. They're a lot closer in Hebrew than what they are in their transliterations into English. Okay, so there's that. Why would Samaria be chosen as a good strategic capital? Any ideas there? The name, go ahead, I'm sorry. Very good, nice, Freddie. Like most of these places, remember, builds Ramah. Why? It's called hill. Builds, the places Mizpah. Why? It means high place. Yeah, I looked up Samaria. The meaning of it is watch mountain, or it's a good mountain from which you can watch all of the area, and especially while all this conflict's going on. Down the road, Samaria, and a high hill, maybe this very one, is going to be used to build the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. And you remember when Jesus and his disciples in John 4 are passing through the area of Samaria because maybe they have to make a quick trip, or just maybe he's seeking this one person that he knows is going to be there. And he has this conversation with the woman. As they're standing there in this high place, the woman says, well, you Jews say that in Jerusalem is a place that we ought to worship. My fathers have worshipped on this mountain. Samaria, the Samaritans, is the site of the Samaritan temple that gets built on Mount Gerizim, and I'm sure it's not the original one, but if you look it up, you'll be able to see there is still a Samaritan temple today, and that is used on Mount Gerizim. But this is a high hill, this is a high place, so Freddie, it makes a lot of sense, and this place is purchased for 2 talents of silver. A talent's about 75 pounds, so roughly 150 pounds of silver are used to obtain this location. He names it after the one who owned this, Shemer, Samaria. Verse 25, Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord, did worse than all who were before him. We ever read that about Israel yet? For he walked in all the ways of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and in his sin by which he had made Israel sin, provoking the Lord God of Israel to anger with their idols. This is another one. I wish I could tell you more about this. Is if he's just doing what all the ancestors did, why are his sins any worse? I think there's the insinuation here that he takes it and each one is taking it a step further than the generation before them. Turn to Micah chapter 6. Just briefly, we'll read this short verse. Later, God has this charge against his people through the prophet. Micah chapter 6, if it's helpful, you have Jonah, right? Jonah, Nahum, Habakkuk, right? So you have Jonah, Micah, Nahum. So if that's any help to you. Micah chapter 6, verse 16. He says of his people, you have kept the statutes of Omri and all the works of the next generation of the house of Ahab. You've walked in their counsels. And he says that I may make you a desolation, your inhabitants a hissing, so you shall bear the scorn of my people. This serves as a benchmark. This guy did something especially repulsive in the sight of God. Now we're about to just briefly get introduced to Ahab, and believe it or not, it gets even worse under his watch. But there's something that he does. Does he just increase the golden calf worship? Maybe more locations, more service of it, more encouragement for it? Or is it possible that he introduces even more idols than the golden calves that are that are being worshipped? Does he institute more laws, making it illegal about traveling to Jerusalem and the temple to worship the true God? These are all possibilities. Could be a mix and match, maybe something else also. Go ahead, Emily. 1 second, please.
I was just thinking that where God made such an effort to give a public punishment to these evil kings, and for then their predecessors to follow up, and like how hard-hearted they would have to be to then go ahead and still follow in those footsteps.
Excellent, Emily. So that could be what it is too. It's just they're not learning from history. And we certainly know as the human race goes on, we talk about it sometimes, Acts 17, 30 and 31, truly these times of ignorance God overlooked, now he commands all men everywhere to repent. He expects more as we grow up. You know, fathers and mothers and households, the older the kids get, the more we expect out of them. Same is true of the human race. Same is true of a nation. Same is true of a nation's rulers. So very good point, Emily. That may be what it is also. Super. So continuing on in verse 28, verse 27. Now the rest of the acts of Omri, which he did, and the might that he showed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? So Omri rested with his fathers, and he was buried in the new capital now. The capital has changed locations 3 times within 50 years, which gives you kind of an idea of the turbulence of the nation. So Omri rested with his fathers and was buried in Samaria. Then Ahab, his son, reigned in his place. Very quickly, I want to define for you. The name of Ahab means father's brother. Father's brother. Okay, who is Ahab's dad? Okay, he's the worst so far. Good. What's Ahab's dad's name? Omri. Okay. And so he's saying father, who is Omri. So Ahab's name means Omri's brother. Obviously, he's not his brother. He's his son. But when you have someone who is another's brother, what does that often tell you about the person? Okay. I had a teacher, a new teacher. We were talking about Caden, who's helping out at the school. And she doesn't know all of them yet and getting to know kids and teachers and all that. And she said, now Hudson, that has to be Caden's brother. I've seen them. And okay, you get the point. Yeah, they're a lot like one another. And so if we know about Ahab, his name means father's brother, or I'm basically Omri's brother, what does that tell you about Ahab? He's going to be just like his daddy, only, as was stated by Roy, even a little bit worse. So let's finish up these last few verses in chapter 16. 29, in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, that's in 872 BC, king of Judah, Ahab the son of Omri became king over Israel, and Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel in Samaria for 22 years. Pretty good span, really. Now, Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. And it came to pass as though it had been a trivial thing, as if it's a small matter for him to walk in the sons of Jeroboam the son of Nebat in the idol worship of the calves, that he took his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. And I'll show you on the map. We don't have it here, but it's going to be up to the northwest just a little bit on our map, outside the territory of God's people. And he went and served Baal and worshiped him. Okay, a little bit of time we have remaining. I want to define for you a few terms here. Ethbaal, who is Jezebel's daddy. Okay? Ethbaal means with Baal, or I'm with Baal. Shows the allegiance of the family. Jezebel means Baal exalts, Baal is husband to, or in other words, her name means I'm married to Baal. Baal's my commitment in life. Or it means unchaste or impure. How fitting for this one. This quotation comes from James Smith, his Old Testament commentary. Tradition identified him, Ethbaal, Jezebel's dad, as the priest of Astarte, is the way it's pronounced, a Canaanite goddess of fertility and reproduction. That's sexual impurity. Who assassinated the king of Sidon and usurped the throne. He says this tradition would account for Jezebel's fierce character and her fanatical devotion to the gods of her country. This woman was a pagan missionary. She came to Israel with the avowed purpose of making her god, Baal Melkart, the supreme god in the land. So her family comes to power through treason, and her dad has been serving this god of sexual immorality, and as well, she's entirely devoted, her dad being a priest to this false religion. This religion means everything to her. And she very likely comes to Israel with the intent purpose of trying to convert all of these infidels and executing her God's wrath over the people of Israel's God, Yahweh. Now, I think that makes a lot of sense as we go into a discussion of this woman, why she acts the way she does. Verse 32, then he set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal. By the way, Baal means Lord, who is the supreme male divinity of the Canaanites, the chief god of their whole system of gods and goddesses. So he set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. All right, who would like to say our memory verse, and we'll bring things to a close then.
And Ahab made a wooden image. Ahab provoked the Lord God of Israel to anger more than all of the other kings of Israel.
You would think that not to be possible, wouldn't you? They just take it one step further. But it makes perfect sense. This guy marries someone who's married to, her number one commitment in life is a false god. What do you know? He turns over to this new false god, not new, but newer maybe than the golden calf worship that's been going on, right? Still not listening to God, and even the Old Testament prophecies that are made of the Savior of the universe, right? Very good. Now, I know it seems really harsh as you're going through this study, and when God says, hey, the sins of these people are gross and it's long overdue, go in and kill everything, tear down every altar that you find, man, woman, and child, and we think, well, that's not very humanitarian. And so they don't do what God says. And it ends up in the destruction of their lives and of their kids and of their grandkids and their entire country. So you tell me, what would have been the right thing to do? What God said, or to do things the more, as we might see it, humanitarian way? Verse 34, in his days Hillel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundation with Abiram, his firstborn, with his youngest, Segeb. He set up his gates, according to the word of the Lord, which he had spoken through Joshua, the son of Nun. If you're interested in this, you can look at it and read it for yourself. Joshua 6:26. The prophecy was made. When Jericho's walls came crashing down, the city was completely destroyed. God says, anyone who tries to rebuild this city and its walls, you're going to lose your first kid, and you're going to lose your last kid by the time you're done. Well, this guy in Israel takes it upon himself. Hillel does. And he loses his firstborn, and he loses his youngest by the time the completion of the city is finished, just as God spoke through Joshua 550 years earlier. When God says something, he means it. As you can probably tell, these are exceptionally wicked times in the reign of these kings. We'll look more at this timeline whenever the time's right. These are desperate times in Israel, and desperate times call for desperate measures. I don't believe it to be a coincidence when Israel is at her lowest spiritual, moral point. God sends arguably the greatest prophet to date to his people. We'll see what Elijah does among God's servants over these next few class periods. For next time, please read chapter 17, some fascinating stories involving Elijah, one of my favorite biblical characters. 1 Kings 17, we'll do memory work, and 16. 1 Kings 17, 16. Any final thoughts, though? Teenagers? Okay, all right. Thanks for being in here, guys.